The notice on the gate. It started with a letter taped crookedly to the black iron gate. The paper was damp from the morning dew, but the red ink was still legible, bold, accusatory, and entirely out of place. Notice of trespass. You are forbidden from entering HOA property without authorization. Violations will result in law enforcement action. The words glared up like an insult. The house beyond the gate wasn't grand, but it had history. Red brick worn smooth by decades of weather and the scent of oak trees that had stood longer than most of the neighborhood's residents had been alive. For 3 generations, it had belonged to the same family, long before the Homeowners Association existed. The woman who now stood before the notice, her hands folded calmly behind her back, was used to reading threats disguised as legal warnings. Her name was Evelyn Hart, and she had seen far worse. In her line of work, words like trespass, violation, and law enforcement were common currency. But seeing them taped to her own gate, directed at her, was something new. The HOA had been a problem since the day she moved back in her late father's home. She hadn't intended to cause waves. She paid her dues, trimmed the hedges, and followed every rule outlined in their dense, 62-page handbook. But that hadn't stopped the board from finding fault with everything. The paint on her mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Her driveway was non-compliant. Her backyard fence unauthorized. It didn't take long before Evelyn realized it wasn't about rules. It was about control. And at the center of it all was Marcia Ellison, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Marcia was the type who smiled while filing complaints, who weaponized bylaws like arrows, and who believed that authority, once grasped, should never be questioned. The notice was the latest move in Marcia's campaign. A week earlier, Evelyn had caught an HOA contractor trying to install new fencing along her property line. Fencing that would have cut off her private garden, technically annexing part of her yard into community space. She had told them to stop. They hadn't listened. So she'd walked down, camera in hand, and recorded the whole encounter. Apparently, that was enough to make her a trespasser. As she stood there reading the notice again, Evelyn felt no fear, only a quiet, simmering certainty. These people had no idea who they were dealing with. To them, she was just another homeowner, someone who would argue, threaten to call a lawyer, and eventually give up. They didn't know that calling a lawyer would have been redundant. Evelyn was the lawyer. More than that, she was the Honorable Judge Evelyn Hart of the county civil court, the same court where HOA disputes were settled when residents refused to back down. She smiled faintly at the irony. They wanted to play legal games, but she'd spent her entire career writing the rules they thought they understood. Still, she said nothing to anyone. Not yet. She let the board continue their little performance. The warnings, the fake citations, the smug emails about enforcement escalation. Every letter they sent her, every threat they drafted, she kept neatly filed in a folder marked evidence. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about precedent. And when she was finished, there would be a record of what happens when power is abused in the name of order. As she closed the gate behind her and walked up the path toward the house, the morning sun caught the edge of the letter. It fluttered, then tore free, carried away by the wind. A fitting omen, she thought, because soon that entire board would come undone just as easily. And it would start sooner than they could imagine. The meeting behind closed doors. The HOA clubhouse sat at the center of the neighborhood, a polished stone building meant to symbolize community. In truth, it functioned more like a fortress, a place where decisions were made behind closed doors, and those who disagreed were quietly written off as troublemakers. On a humid Thursday evening, the parking lot was packed. A special board session had been called, and word spread quickly through the community chat. Most residents didn't know why the emergency meeting had been summoned, but rumors drifted, something about a homeowner violating restricted access, about potential police involvement. The whispers grew until every lawn chair and folding seat in the clubhouse was filled. Evelyn arrived early, not to defend herself. She had no intention of dignifying baseless claims, but to observe. She sat quietly in the back, her composure immaculate, her expression unreadable. Around her, board members shuffled papers, adjusted microphones, and whispered to one another with the forced confidence of people who mistook paperwork for power. At the head of the table sat Marcia Ellison, flanked by her loyal deputies, a retired real estate agent, a part-time accountant, and a man who had once sued his neighbor over a tree branch. Together, they formed what they called the Governance Committee. Together, they decided who belonged. The meeting began with formalities, motions, approvals, and nods exchanged like currency. Then came the main event. Marcia cleared her throat, the microphone squealing slightly as she leaned forward. She read from a printed statement, carefully avoiding eye contact with the back row. The words were familiar: trespassing, violation, safety concern, escalation. The story had been rehearsed, reshaped to make Evelyn sound like a reckless intruder, a woman who had entered restricted HOA property, who had verbally confronted contractors, and who had ignored multiple directives. The audience murmured. That was the point. Marcia didn't want resolution. She wanted spectacle. She wanted to create a narrative before facts could catch up. And for a few minutes, she succeeded. Evelyn watched, silent, noting every misstatement, every conveniently omitted fact. She had seen the same performance countless times in courtrooms. The difference was that those people knew she was the judge. Here, she was simply the accused. When Marcia finished, the board members exchanged glances, pretending to deliberate. Then, with a grave tone that barely concealed satisfaction, Marcia announced that they would be involving law enforcement to ensure compliance. A few gasps echoed. Some residents glanced back at Evelyn, their curiosity now tinged with discomfort. Marcia, sensing victory, adjourned the meeting with a smug smile. Evelyn rose, collected her folder, and walked out before the applause began. It was the polite kind of applause that hides unease, neighbors trying to appear supportive of authority, afraid to be next. Outside, the air was thick and still. A police cruiser idled near the entrance, its lights off, but its presence deliberate. One of Marcia's deputies stood nearby, talking animatedly to the officer. Evelyn walked past them without a word, her heels tapping softly against the pavement. That night, she sat in her study, the faint sound of cicadas filling the silence. She reviewed the HOA's bylaws, every clause, every procedural rule, every section that granted the board authority. She read them as if preparing a case. In a way, she was. What Marcia and her board didn't realize was that their notice of trespass had crossed a legal boundary. They had declared private, deeded property to be HOA-controlled, a direct violation of county zoning statutes and their own charter. In their eagerness to punish, they had incriminated themselves. By midnight, Evelyn had drafted her first motion, a formal injunction request. But she wasn't filing it yet, not until the board made their next move. She wanted them to step fully into the trap they'd built, and soon they would. The police at the gate. It happened early on a Saturday morning, the kind of still, golden morning that usually smelled like coffee and damp grass. But that peace fractured with the crunch of tires on gravel. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of Evelyn Hart's gate, their lights flashing lazily in the sunlight. Neighbors peeked through blinds and half-drawn curtains, phones already in hand, ready to record what they thought would be the downfall of the defiant homeowner. Marcia Ellison was there too, of course, dressed in a pastel blazer and holding a clipboard like a badge of authority. She stood beside the officers, speaking with animated gestures and theatrical sighs. From her porch, Evelyn watched the scene unfold with the calm detachment of someone who'd seen far worse than suburban theatrics. She waited until they called out her name. Then, with deliberate grace, she stepped outside. The gate creaked open, the same gate that bore the notice a week before. The same gate the HOA claimed she had no right to touch. The officers were polite but uncertain, clearly briefed by Marcia's embellished version of events. They explained there had been a trespassing complaint, that the HOA had reported her for entering restricted property. Evelyn listened quietly, nodding as they spoke. Then she asked one simple question, a question no one in that moment realized would unravel the entire case. She asked which property, exactly, they believed she had trespassed upon. When the lead officer pointed to her own yard, the one she had inherited, taxed, and maintained for decades, Evelyn only smiled faintly. She handed him a thin folder, the deed, the plat map, and a certified copy of the county's land records, all stamped and signed. For a long moment, the officer just stared. The confusion deepened. Marcia began to speak again, her tone tightening, her confidence cracking. But Evelyn didn't interrupt. She simply turned and gestured toward the fence line, the so-called restricted area that the HOA's contractors had tried to claim. Every inch of it, every blade of grass, was legally hers. The lead officer finally cleared his throat, turning toward Marcia with visible irritation. Evelyn could see the shift, the moment where authority, once assumed, began to crumble under fact. Marcia stammered, insisting it was common property, citing HOA bylaws as if they could override recorded land ownership. But the officers weren't interested in bylaws anymore. They had seen enough. When they left, without issuing a citation, without arresting anyone, the silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation. Marcia stood frozen, her face pale, the clipboard drooping in her hands. Around the neighborhood, blinds snapped shut. The show was over. Evelyn didn't say a word. She simply watched Marcia retreat, heels clacking across the pavement, fury and embarrassment mingling in every rigid movement. The HOA president had expected a spectacle, a public humiliation of her rival. Instead, she had given Evelyn exactly what she needed: proof of harassment, documented by law enforcement. That afternoon, Evelyn sat once more in her study. The injunction she had drafted now had supporting evidence: the police incident report, the photographs, the timestamps. Every action the HOA had taken was now traceable. Every attempt to intimidate her had become part of the record. The next step wouldn't be taken quietly. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to dismantle the system that allowed people like Marcia to believe they were untouchable. The paperwork sat neatly on her desk, the ink still drying. She would file it on Monday morning, not as a homeowner, but as Judge Evelyn Hart, in full legal capacity. And when the HOA board received that summons, their polished clubhouse would feel a lot less like a fortress and a lot more like a courtroom. The summons. Monday morning broke with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. At the county courthouse, a clerk stamped a thick manila envelope with crimson ink filed. Inside were the documents that would bring the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association into civil court. The case title, printed neatly at the top, was enough to make any board member's stomach drop. Evelyn Hart versus Maple Ridge HOA, et al. By mid-afternoon, the summonses were delivered. A uniformed process server made his way through the manicured streets of the neighborhood, stopping at each board member's home. Neighbors watched from porches as he handed over the envelopes, their curiosity sharpening with each delivery. Marcia Ellison's expression when she opened hers was said to be unforgettable, the practiced smile collapsing into disbelief, her fingers trembling as she scanned the header. The documents were meticulous, precise, and devastating. Evelyn hadn't merely accused the HOA of harassment. She had built a comprehensive case alleging abuse of authority, defamation, and fraudulent misrepresentation of property boundaries. Attached were exhibits: every notice, every email, every recorded statement. Even copies of the HOA's own bylaws were annotated, highlighting each rule they had violated in their attempt to control her. The news spread faster than gossip ever could. By sunset, the entire community knew the woman they had labeled a problem homeowner was taking the board to court, and she wasn't just any plaintiff. She was the Honorable Judge Evelyn Hart, the same woman whose rulings had shaped property law in the very county where Maple Ridge stood. Panic set in at the clubhouse. Emergency meetings were called. Marcia's confident voice now quivered as she spoke about misunderstandings and procedural errors. Some board members, realizing how deep they were in, began to distance themselves. Others whispered about resigning before the court date. But it was too late. The summonses had been served. The process had begun. Meanwhile, Evelyn went about her routine as if nothing had changed. She trimmed her roses, greeted the mailman, and took her evening walks as usual. But beneath that calm exterior, she was methodical, organizing her evidence, preparing her argument, anticipating every defense they might attempt. She knew their kind of arrogance. She'd seen it in court too many times. People who abused authority rarely believed they could lose it. 3 days later, the HOA sent a letter, their tone suddenly soft, filled with apologies and requests for amicable resolution. They offered to correct the misunderstanding, to withdraw the notices, to restore all property boundaries to their prior state. Evelyn read it once, then placed it in her growing folder of evidence. She didn't need apologies. She needed accountability. When the hearing date was announced, it became the talk of the town. Residents began revisiting their own experiences, the unfair fines, the ignored maintenance requests, the favoritism. For years, people had accepted the board's dominance as an unshakable fact of neighborhood life. Now, someone was finally challenging it, not with angry emails or whispered complaints, but through the very system the HOA thought they understood best. The night before the first court session, Evelyn stood at her window, the lights of the clubhouse glowing faintly in the distance. Cars came and went. She could almost imagine the panic inside, the hurried preparations, the frantic attempts to appear composed. It struck her then how power truly worked. Fragile, dependent on perception, easily shattered when confronted with truth. The HOA had built its influence on fear and compliance. But fear had a short lifespan once people realized it was misplaced. As she turned off the lights and set her briefcase by the door, she knew that tomorrow would be the beginning of the end, not just for Marcia Ellison, but for the entire board that had mistaken intimidation for governance. By the time the gavel fell, the neighborhood that had once watched her with suspicion would see her differently. Not as a rebel, not as a trespasser, but as the judge who finally brought the HOA to justice.